Hi. So this Shabbos, we read two portions, Behar and Bechukotai. And that will take us to the end of the book of Leviticus, third book of the five books of the Torah. Behar, the word means in the mountain or by the mountain or at the mountain. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. That's where we get the name of the title. And Bechukotai means through or with or in my laws. God speaks to the Israelites and says, if you follow my laws, okay, the following will happen. And once again, the issue is, why do we have a double portion, Behar and Bechukotai? We've had this a couple of times in the book of Leviticus this year. There are 54 portions in the Torah, and we have 52 weeks in the year, but we have some weeks like Passover and Sukkot on Shabbat when we don't read a regular portion. So depending whether it's a leap year when we add 4 extra Shabboses, or it's a regular year, we either sometimes need to expand the Torah for a greater number of weeks, or condense it to fit it in, squeeze it into the year. So depending on whether it's a leap year or not, we have the ability to either read separate portions, or if we need to, we combine portions, and so that we can get it all done within 1 year, the reading of the Torah. So the first portion I want to look at is in Leviticus chapter 25. And first we deal with the sabbatical year. Every 7th year, the land was commanded to be let fallow. You weren't allowed to plant, which is a remarkable notion, that already 3,000 years ago, there was this ecological sense that the land needs to replenish itself. And if you use up all the nutrients by just keep planting in every single year, eventually it's going to go dry, and there's not going to be the ability to have a harvest. So they already knew that. I'm sure it wasn't the Jews alone who figured that out, but it's part of the Torah. So that's the sabbatical year. Once every 7th year, leave the land fallow. In the second thing we read about is the Jubilee year. Jubilee, from the Hebrew word yovel, which literally means a ram. And it was called the year of the ram because in that Jubilee year, which was the 50th year, we blow the shofar, the ram's horn. You'll see why. So chapter 25, verse 8 says the following: you shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives you a total of 49 years. Then you shall sound the horn loud, right? And of course, it's shofar, v'havarta shofar tru'ah. Sound the shofar in the 7th month on the 10th day of the month, which is the Day of Atonement. Okay, so after 49 years, and then the following year begins in Tishrei, and on Yom Kippur, the shofar is blown to let everybody know that it is a Jubilee year. You shall have the horn sounded throughout your land, and you shall hallow the 50th year. Then listen to this very next verse, very famous. In our translation, it says, you shall proclaim release throughout the land for all its inhabitants. The idea of a release was that slaves, which were really indentured servants, people who couldn't pay off their bills, who needed to become indentured servants to the people they owed as a way of paying off. But every 50th year, the shofar was blown and everybody went free and you started all over again. Not only that, if you were an indentured servant, but land was in your tribe and then in your family. And if people out of poverty needed to sell off their ancestral lands, in the 50th year, the shofar was blown and we started the slate clean, right? Everybody was able to go back and reclaim their original land. So the translation we have, which is a pretty accurate one, you shall proclaim release throughout the land. However, the King James Version of that verse, the translation says, proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof, right? So what really is meant as a kind of release is understood as liberty. Yes, if you were an indentured servant, you went free. Here's the fascinating thing. When the Quakers came from England in the 17th century, and they established themselves mainly around Philadelphia, because the Quakers were looking for religious freedom. So what did they do? One of the early things was to cast a bell and to write this verse from this Torah portion on that bell. Proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. So originally it was meant by the Quakers as we have liberty, freedom of religion. Not too long after, during the 1770s, this bell became the symbol of freedom from England. And then later, during the Civil War, this bell became the symbol of abolitionists, proclaim liberty to those African slaves, right? They should be allowed to be free. And of course, we all know the bell was rung at some point. I believe the death of John Marshall, and the bell cracked. Hence, we have the Liberty Bell, which you can still see with its crack in Philadelphia. So, given that background of this verse being adopted for the Liberty Bell, and the Liberty Bell having a crack, and the Jubilee year that we're reading about here is proclaimed with the blowing of the shofar, I put all of those things together, and this is what I came up with. So the verse, remember, is you shall count off 7 weeks of years, then you shall sound the shofar, you shall hallow the 50th year, you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. And I'm imagining a tour guide, right, leading a bunch of tourists. Good morning, everyone. I'm Shmuel, your madrich. Madrich, Hebrew word for a guide. I'd like to show you something very special today. Follow me, stay together. Okay, here we are. In this display case, you see a very old shofar. Look carefully and notice that there is a crack in the ram's horn. This was the shofar that our ancestors used to blow every 50th year to signal the beginning of the Jubilee year. At that time, every family who had been forced to sell their land because of financial need was allowed to return to their original family holdings and start over fresh, free from debt. This shofar became a symbol of freedom, not only freedom from financial straits and indentured servitude, but political freedom from our enemies as well. This was the shofar that was used by Joshua as he circled the walls of Jericho. This was the shofar that was blown when Gideon the prophet and his 300 men attacked the Midianites in the middle of the night. Gideon is part of the judges, somewhere between Joshua and King Saul. For about 100, 150 years, there was a period when there was no formal leader. And every time there was an enemy, God would choose a judge or a prophet who would become a military as well as the political leader to unify the people against their enemies. Gideon is one of the more famous of the judges. And one of the interesting things about the Gideon story is he goes against the entire Midianite army, but he takes only 300 men against tens of thousands. What does he do? He sneaks up to them in the middle of the night. He puts torches inside clay vessels, and each of the 300 men had a shofar. They sneak into the camp from 3 different directions, and what do? They smash the jugs that the torch is in. So all of a sudden, from darkness, you have 300 torches lit up. And then 300 men then blow their shofarot, their shofars. Usually you only had one bugler, one shofar blower. Imagine what the enemy must have thought if they hear 300 shofars from all these different directions and flashing lights which appear in the middle of the night. They're totally confused. They start killing each other. They can't see who's where, what, when, and Gideon leads a great victory. So that's the reference to Gideon and the shofar. This was the shofar that was blown when King Saul saved the residents of Yavesh Gilad from the Ammonites. The people's tribe, the Ammonites, threatened the town of Yavesh Gilad, which was sort of on the border of where Israel was. And the Ammonites said, we're going to let you people live, but we're going to gouge out one eye from every man, just so that you know who's boss here. Well, the people went to King Saul and said, please save us. And in Saul's first great victory was he went against the Ammonites. So I'm imagining him with his shofar leading his people, his army, against the enemy. This was the shofar that was used to rally the Israelites to pursue the Philistines after David killed Goliath. We all know that story. But sadly, this was also the shofar that was used on the day that King Saul and his son Jonathan were killed in battle. The enemy trampled it as they overran our army, and it was then that it was cracked. It was later recovered and brought back to the Israelite camp. It serves today as a reminder of our history. Thousands of tourists like you come every year and wait in long lines to see it and to remember who we are and where we came from. So I have no reason to believe that there was one shofar that was used in all of these events. But again, playing on the notion of the Liberty Bell functioning at several different points in American history, and then ultimately being cracked, I wanted to apply that same story to the idea of the shofar. So that's where this week's Midrash came from. Okay, so let's look now to chapter 26 in the book of Leviticus. And here we start the Torah portion, second Torah portion of the week called Bechukotai. One of the things about Bechukotai is that it contains what we call the Tochacha. The Tochacha could mean the warning or the admonishing. And what it does is it contains first blessings and then curses. And basically, at this point, God, through Moses, tells the Israelites, okay, you people, listen up. Here's the deal. If you follow the Torah, then things will go good. If you don't follow the Torah, things are going to go bad. It's up to you. You make the choice. Okay? So in this story, I have Moses and God arguing over carrots and sticks. You know, the whole notion of when do you use the carrot with the mule, sort of entice him to go forward, reward him. When do you use the stick to smack him on the rear end, get moving, right? The punishment. So one of the things that I was dealing with this little story is the following, that when you read a number of portions in the Torah, you gotta admit that God comes across sometimes as rather harsh. Now, we could ask the following question. Is that because this is an accurate representation of God, and God sometimes actually is pretty harsh? Or is this how God was perceived by the writer, and the writer paints God as harsh? That may not be God's real personality, but that's at least how the author saw God. Okay? So here I'm imagining Moses and God, God as the writer, Moses as the editor. We don't usually think of things that way. We think of God as the one who is dictating, right? The dictator in both meanings of the word. And Moses is the dictatee. He is the one who is taking notes. He's writing it all down. And that's the way traditionally it's understood. But I was wondering if, since God sometimes comes across as really harsh, is it possible that Moses could act as God's editor and say to him, just like any editor would say to an author, you got some good stuff here, but it needs some touch-ups. It needs some work. I don't think this is going to go over well. I think you could do a better job with this passage. That's a fascinating, to me, idea that it was not Moses simply writing down what God tells him, but in a sense, doing an edit on God's draft. So here's what I imagined. Moses says, after that unpleasantness with the golden calf, I think we need to add something to the Torah. So clearly the people, they know what they're supposed to do, but what do? They go and they build an idol. So it's not so simple. Tell the people, here's what I expect of you, and the people are going to follow. Moses knows firsthand, as well as God, that this is a stiff-necked people who don't always do the right thing, don't always do what they're told. So he says, I think we need to add something to the Torah. God says, like what? Moses says, like why the people should obey it. God says, what are you talking about? Isn't it enough that I, master of the universe, commanded it? And Moses says, after what happened at Sinai with the golden calf, apparently not. So God's response to the editor is, fine, if you think it will help, I can threaten them. If they don't obey me, I will unleash upon them consumption, fever, defeat by their enemies, death by the sword, drought, famine, attack of wild beasts, pestilence, cannibalism of their own children, exile, paranoia, depression, ruined cities, desolate sanctuaries. That ought to do it. And indeed, as you read this section called the Tochacha, you find that these 14 different punishments are there, and they're, threatening the people. If you follow my laws, this is what's going to happen. But if you don't, you're going to get all of these things. And there's a long list, long paragraphs. And sometimes it's pretty gut-wrenching. The most gut-wrenching of all is there'll be no food, and that people will ultimately eat their dead children because they're desperate. They're dying of hunger. So Moses says the following to God, who suggests, I'll threaten them. Moses says, as your agent and publicist. I want to stop there. That's an interesting notion, that sometimes Moses has to sell to the people, right, this whatever God wants. So God comes up with the idea. We think that God said it, that people are going to listen. Moses says that's not the way these people work, right? I'm your publicist. I'm your agent. I'm trying to do a favor for you. I'm trying to sell your stuff, your ideas. So Moses says, as your agent and publicist, I would urge you to reconsider. Your approval rating went way down after that execution of the blasphemer last week. You may remember that at the very end of last week's Torah portion in Emor, we found out that there was an Israelite whose mother was an Israelite, but whose father was an Egyptian. Okay? And ultimately, that Israelite curses, blasphemes, says something horrible about God. The people don't know what are we supposed to do with this? Moses goes to God. This guy took your name in vain. This guy said terrible things about you. This guy pronounced your holy name. What are we supposed to do with him? And ultimately, God says, take him out, have the people stone him. And indeed, that's what occurs. The people surround the man. They each pick up rocks. You've got dozens, scores, hundreds of people who pelt the guy with rocks, and he dies. We can't imagine that scene warmed the hearts of the people. God, this is his response. Somebody says something bad about God, and that person is taken out and killed. Well, maybe it's right, maybe it's not right, but ultimately, the people have got to say in their minds, wow, you don't want to mess with this God, right? And Moses is saying your approval rating went way down last week after the execution of the blasphemer. God defends himself and said, I needed to make an example of him. I can't have people going around disrespecting me. So you're suggesting that I let the inmates run the asylum? And once again, Moses is the voice of reason. God is the one who's flying off the handle here. Moses says to God, that's the kind of phrase, letting the inmates run the asylum. That's the kind of phrase I wish you wouldn't use. No, what I'm talking about is that instead of threatening the people, we should show them why it's in their best interest to obey you and follow the Torah. God is completely clueless here. He says, give me an example. Moses says, okay, here's what we should say. If you follow God's laws, you'll get rain, abundant produce, peace, security, no vicious beasts, victory over your enemies, even when you're outnumbered, many children, a strong relationship with a loving and protecting God. God, he's not buying it. He don't like it. Sounds like bribery to me, like we're offering little children candy in order to get them to do the right thing. You'll remember that one of the laws in the Torah is against bribery. Moses comes back with, okay, will you meet me halfway on this? You keep in the punishments, but we'll add the rewards as well. If the one doesn't get them on board, perhaps the other will. And God sort of agrees, but is not happy. If it'll make you happy, and storms off. This leads perhaps to, this is a radically different way of seeing the figures, the characters of God and Moses. And again, it's playing on the idea that sometimes God comes across not as always warm and fuzzy, but sometimes as really strict and harsh, and you don't want to mess with him. And it ultimately raises a much deeper question that parents, teachers, we all have to deal with, which is how do you motivate people to do what you want them to do? And is it threatening them, scaring them into doing it, or to convince them, or to bribe them? Or is it simply you don't need punishments at all, you don't need rewards at all? You make it clear this is the right thing, this is what you should do, end of the matter. Or, you know what, if you do this, you'll find that it's beneficial. So again, to what extent do we bribe our kids? To what extent do we threaten our kids? Right? What's the best approach to teaching? To promise an A+, or to threaten a failing grade, right? And all that means. So that deeper question applies to God and the Torah as well. Why should we, keep the Torah? Why should we observe it? Do we do it because we're afraid of going to hell? Do we do it because we're hoping to get into heaven? Do we do it because we understand this is the right thing to do? Okay, so we have that question. Finally, from the Torah, we go to chapter 27. And here, this chapter is sort of an addendum to the book of Leviticus. Listen to this, very strange. Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when anyone explicitly vows to the Lord the equivalent for a human being, the following scale shall apply. In other words, people would come and they would say, I hereby vow to pledge, I give, I donate my worth to the temple. Okay, so what did that mean? Well, we're told the following scale shall apply. If it is a male from 20 to 60 years of age, the equivalent is 50 shekels of silver by the sanctuary weight. So if you're in that age group and you say, I hereby pledge my worth to the temple as my donation, right? Well, if you're a male and you fit into that category, that means 50 shekels. If it's a female, the equivalent is 30 shekels. So we're going to have to talk about that one in a second. How come a man, it's 50? How come for a woman of the same age, it's 30? What's going on there? If the age is from 5 to 20, right? So either you're pledging the worth of your child, okay? Or maybe you're older and you pledge your own worth, but you're 18 years old. The equivalent is 20 shekels for a male, 10 shekels for a female. And if the age is from 1 month to 5 years, the equivalent for a male is 5 shekels. The equivalent for a female is 3 shekels of silver. And then, by the way, if the age is 60 years or over, the equivalent is 15 shekels in the case of a male, 10 shekels for a female. So apparently, for whatever reason, instead of just saying, I hereby, here's what I got, here's what I can afford, I hereby pledge 10 shekels, or I hereby pledge 100 shekels. That apparently the custom was people to say, I pledge my worth as my gift to the temple. Well, depending on your gender, depending on your age, here's what your worth equals. Okay, so that was the section from the Torah. What we have here clearly is a way to raise funds for the temple. Now, you may remember back in the book of Exodus, Ki Tisa, we were told that everyone from the age of 20 and above, the males, they had to give a half of a shekel. Apparently, that was in the beginning of Exodus. Now we're at the end of Leviticus. And apparently, there must have been the sense that we're not raising enough money. We have to give other fundraising opportunities to people. So apparently they had this notion, in addition to the half shekel, which everybody had to give, I, as a voluntary donation, I want to give my worth to the temple. So here's what I'm imagining. In the minutes of the Board of Trustees meeting that must have taken place around that time, the president of the congregation calls on the chairman of the fundraising committee, who makes the following recommendation and reads the following report at the monthly trustee meeting. Report of the fundraising committee. We met because the mandatory half shekel donation from each Israelite is not sufficient to meet our financial needs. After much discussion, we voted to recommend a voluntary donation campaign. Donators will be encouraged to come to the tabernacle and declare, I pledge my worth. Contributions will be made according to the following schedule. For men under 20 years, the amount would be 20 shekels. For women, 10. For men 20 to 60, the amount would be 50 shekels. For women, 30. For men over 60, the amount would be 15 shekels. For women, 10. And then, as a further note in the report of the fundraising committee, along with this schedule, there was concern that women will be very upset about the disparity between male versus female. It should be noted that the difference was based on the price one would get on the market for purchasing a slave, it being understood that male slaves could do more heavy labor and thus fetch a higher price than a female slave. And women generally have less access to disposable income than men do. So we were merely being realistic. There was also concern that so soon after being freed from slavery in Egypt, we are setting up a system that is based on valuing human beings as slaves are, which is a good point. Some suggested that we just allow the contributors to decide how much they wish to donate. The downside of this is that the rich will be able to give more, the poor less. And that will create a hierarchy in our community based on wealth. No matter what we decide, someone will be upset. Other fundraising ideas we kicked around included an annual journal dinner dance. You can imagine that in the days of Moses. A holiday bazaar, a casino night, and allowing Israelites to purchase plaques dedicating the various items in the tabernacle. So obviously we're borrowing some of the things that we do today and projecting it backward to the fundraising committee and their way of trying to figure out how to raise funds. Just an additional thought, again, to the question, why do you have to say, I pledge myself, I pledge my worth, and not just say, I pledge 10 shekels or whatever I choose the amount? And I'm wondering if there's a hidden meaning here, that people were, maybe the Torah was interested in not just the money that could be raised, but maybe in the idea of somebody saying, I pledge myself to the temple, and put aside the finances here. The notion of I pledge to show up to an evening minyan once a week. I pledge myself to come to a Shabbos service every now and then. I pledge myself to come to adult education. I pledge myself to come to some of the social programs that we run. I pledge myself to support the temple by getting involved in a social action project. So maybe, somebody basically coming and saying, I pledge myself to the temple, or I pledge my worth to the temple. You know what? We could use you to volunteer for a committee. We could use you to volunteer to serve on the board of trustees. We could use you to volunteer to serve on the executive board and to take on more responsibility and to help us to thrive. Okay, so now we come to the Haftarah. Whenever we have a double portion, remember there's 54 portions, each portion has a Haftarah. We read 2 portions. Does that mean we're supposed to read 2 Haftorahs on that particular week? God save the bar mitzvah kid who would have to do that, learn twice as much as somebody else. The procedure is we always read the Haftarah for the second, the last portion. So we read the 2 portions of Behar and Bechukotai, and the Haftarah this week is for Bechukotai, for the second portion. One of the things that I've said about Haftorahs is that, especially when we're reading the classical literary prophets, meaning Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the 12 minor prophets, okay, that often their speeches and their words are very literary, very classical. They are, and very difficult for people 3,000, 2,500 years later to decipher and to figure out. And if that's the truth with not only the congregants, that's the truth with the rabbi. I read many of the Haftorahs, even in English, forget the Hebrew. I read many of the Haftorahs in English, and I've got to scratch my head. And I realize, okay, I'm going to have to get out a couple of my books, and I'm going to have to go do some research and background studying and figure out what is he talking about, and what was going on. So, and I've often made the point that when we give 13-year-olds these incredibly difficult speeches, first of all, we give it to them in Hebrew, no chance they have an idea what's going on. Even if we study that with them in English, it's often beyond them. A 13-year-old just won't get it. Not only the language, but the historical context, right? You truly need to be a biblical scholar. So what my position, my point of view is that forget about the words for a moment, that the prophets were doing street theater, that it was their actions which were more important than their speeches. You get bored listening to a speech, but if somebody is acting out a little performance, that's going to grab your attention. And so the actions, in my opinion, were more important to convey to the people who were not literary scholars 2,500, 3,000 years ago. They probably didn't get a lot of what the prophet was saying either. So when I look at a prophecy and a Haftorah, I'm always asking the question, what action did he take? What street theater was he presenting? And what impression would it make upon the people? And what was the lesson? So let me just give you an example of words being beyond us. So in Jeremiah chapter 17, Jeremiah in this long speech says, like a partridge hatching what she did not lay, so is one who amasses wealth by unjust means. In the middle of his life, it will leave him, and in the end, he will be proved a fool. Okay, so I get this idea about one who amasses wealth by unjust means, but what's the notion about the partridge hatching what she did not lay? Now, one of the folk beliefs, whether it's based on true ornithology and science, I can't tell you. But I can tell you that in the ancient world, they believed that the partridge, for whatever reason, often would be found sitting on eggs in a nest that were not her own. Okay? And people understood stupid partridge, stupid bird, right? Sitting on, trying to hatch eggs that aren't even her own eggs. What kind of idiot bird is that? So based on that folk belief and based on that piece there, here's the street theater that I imagine took place in this week's Haftorah. A bunch of Jerusalemites are standing around. Number one says, hey, look who's coming. It's Jeremiah. After giving many, many, many speeches and many, many, many street theater demonstrations, people either said, oh, there's a show in store. Let's gather around and watch and see what the crazy guy's going to do this time. Number two says, what's he holding? Is that a bird? Number three says, crazy Jeremiah, the bird man of Jerusalem. Number four shouts out, Hey, Jeremiah, taking your pet bird for a walk? Number 5 says, what is it, a dove? And Jeremiah answers, it's a koreh, using the Hebrew term, a partridge. Number 6 says, dumb bird, sits on the nest of other birds, trying to hatch eggs that aren't even her own. Number 7 says, a stupid bird for a stupid prophet. They all laugh. By the way, one of the things that, maybe we have this image that a prophet gets up and everyone's in awe. Oh my God, what message is he bringing us from God now? We better listen. We better do what he tells us. More often than not, people didn't do what he told them. Sometimes he angered them, insulted them, and they responded by sometimes beating him up, sometimes killing the prophet. Sometimes they just thought he was a fool, and they would throw dirt at him, they would spit at him, they would laugh at him, right? Make fun of him. So all the people laugh. A stupid bird for a stupid prophet. And now is when Jeremiah, the setup's been done and done very well. And now he comes with the punchlines. Thus says the Lord, Korei dagar velo yalad, the partridge trying to hatch what it did not lay. Ose osher velo v'mishpat, is like one who amasses riches unjustly. Bechatzi yamav ya'azvenu, the day will come when it will leave him. Uva acharito yichyeh naval, and in the end, he will be proved a fool. What happens when the partridge sits on the eggs and they ultimately hatch? And they're eaglets. They're not going to necessarily think the partridge is their mother. They're just going to wander off looking for their real mother. So too is the stupid person who thinks if you steal from others, then you got all of their money. And Jeremiah is saying it's no different than the stupid partridge, right? What's going to happen? Just like the eaglets are going to leave the nest and not show any loyalty to the partridge, so too that money that came to you, ill-gotten gains, you're going to lose that one way or the other. You're not going to be able to keep it. Just like the partridge can't keep the eaglets. The stupid bird hatches another's eggs and then watches as the chicks desert her. A stupid people cheat and steal a fortune and are stunned when it's taken from them. Jerusalem number 8 asks, what's he talking about? Jerusalemite number 9 says, is he calling us stupid? Jerusalemite number 10 questions Jeremiah, are you accusing us of stealing? Number 11 in the crowd says, Jeremiah, if you know what's good for you, you'll go away. Number 12 says, before we wring your bird's neck. And 13 adds, and yours too. The very end of the Haftorah, right, the last line is a very beautiful one, and you may even know it. It goes like this. Rifaini Adonai v'hei rafei Hoshieni v'ivasheya ki tehilati ata. Heal me, O Lord, and let me be healed. Save me, and let me be saved, for you are my glory. So the question is, how does he go from talking about partridges and then you people who steal money don't think you're going to be able to keep it? all of a sudden it seems like a non sequitur. At the end, heal me, O Lord, and let me be healed. Save me and let me be saved. And my explanation is that precisely what I said in the story here, people looked at him, threatened him, maybe even beat him up and hurt him badly. And because he delivered the message that needed to be delivered, God is unhappy with you. You steal from others. Don't think you're going to get away with it. Well, they didn't want to hear that. They beat him up. And at the very end, after delivering God's message, Jeremiah asks God, save me from them killing me. Heal me from all the blows that I've received from them. So where might you know this verse from? And the answer is in the daily Amida, morning, afternoon, and evening. We say in the Rifa'enu paragraph, the paragraph that deals with healing, asking God to heal us, what's happened? The rabbis of maybe the 2nd century, late first, early 2nd century, took Jeremiah's line. And remember, Jeremiah said it in the first person singular. Heal me, O Lord, and let me be healed. Save me and let me be saved. The rabbis, right? Jeremiah lives about the year 600 BCE. The rabbis are some 750, 800 years later. The rabbis, in devising, constructing, creating the Amida, borrowed this line from Jeremiah and made a slight change. Whereas Jeremiah was talking about himself, in the Amida, we're praying for all those who are ill. So we changed the singular to the plural. Rifa'enu instead of Rifa'eni, me. Rifa'enu, heal us. Adonai v'nei rafeh, and we will be healed instead of v'ei rafeh, and I will be healed. Hoshienu, save us, v'nivasheya, and we shall be saved instead of v'ivasheya, and I will be saved. One of the principles of Jewish prayer is that in our, the standard liturgy, we never pray in the singular. It's always in the plural. It's never just about us. We can have us in mind, but we also pray for everyone else as well. So we change singular of Jeremiah to the plural for the Amida and the prayer for health. So that's this week's Torah portion, Behar and Bechukotai. And we're going to continue in just about 5 minutes with Mariv. Go take a break. Be right back with you.